God has used throughout history. And the people that he called were not perfect. Sometimes the way we read the story, you almost expect them to be perfect. And I think that's one of the things we do with the character that we're talking about today. We'll be in the book of Esther, which is, I guess, Chronicles would be the biggest one that you're going to come to, and then some of the minor prophets, and then you'll hit Esther. And if you get lost, look in your table of contents. The story of Esther takes place during the captivity in Persia. And Persia is modern-day Iran. And the Jews were brought from the Promised Land, from modern-day Israel, into Persia by King Nebuchadnezzar. And there they were basically told through the prophets, you might as well put down roots because God's going to have you here for a while. So they became part of the culture, but separate from the culture. One of the things that was always said about the Jews is the way that they kept their laws and the ways that they interacted always made them like oil and water with the people around them. Not that they didn't get along, it's just there was a very defined difference between them. Kings come and kings go. The book of Daniel occurs about 100 years prior to this. And a new king comes to the throne. His name is Xerxes, or some of your Bibles might have it as Ahasuerus, which is, Xerxes is the Greek version, Ahasuerus is the Persian version, and there's one more out there whose name I can't remember, but they're all the same guy. He comes to the throne, and he's a little bit different than the kings before him. He's one who likes to give grand gifts to his people. And he's also one who's trying to make the kingdom grow even further, even though it's already been pretty much maxed out. He throws a 180-day party at his palace, invites all of his military leaders, all of his nobles. And Josephus records that this is probably the time that he plans out his invasion of Greece. The invasion of Greece did not go well. He comes back broken from that and trying to figure out a way to regain steam in his kingdom. Another thing that he comes back broken from is there's no longer a queen in the palace. Because during that 180-day party, he got really sloshed, and he decided to ask his wife, Queen Vashti, to do something completely ridiculous. He wanted her to come before all of his nobles wearing her crown. Not a big deal, right? Scholars are kind of divided 50-50 on this. 50% think she was just to come in unveiled with her crown on, which would have been pretty scandalous at the time. But then the other 50% think the king wanted her to come in wearing her crown and only her crown, so everybody could appreciate the fullness of her beauty. She was a little too wise for this game and says back to the king, no way, I am not doing that. And as a result, he sought the wisdom of his nobles and his wise men. What should I do? She disobeyed a direct order. And they all concluded that if they didn't banish her from the kingdom, that it would empower every other woman out there to tell their husbands no. Aren't you glad that happened? So they banish her from the kingdom. He comes back from Greece completely defeated, but there's no woman at home to welcome him home. No one there to help him nurse his wounds. And so his fellow nobles decide, you know what, King, maybe it's time to make look for a new queen. We should put out word to all the different kingdoms, have all the beautiful young virgins brought here, and you can figure out which one you want to make the new queen. So word is sent out because the king agrees, and they look all throughout the kingdom. Who will these young virgins be that are going to try out? And among them was a young girl named Hadassah. She grew up without a mother and without a father. She was orphaned at a young age and was raised by her cousin Mordecai. She was also known through her Persian name as Esther. It says she was beautiful in form and beauty. So basically, she looked good in the face, looked good in the body. And when she was brought into the king's harem for beauty treatments, because before any woman could go and be in the presence of the king, she had to endure 12 months of beauty treatments. I don't know if it was like a spa, which sounds kind of fun for a day or two, or if it was more rigorous than that, but 12 months of just these beauty treatments. And at the conclusion of the 12-month period, each individual girl was sent in at the king's request, and she could take with her whatever she wanted. And if she won the king's favor, she would be made queen. If not, she would be moved to the second section of the harem where she would probably never be heard from again unless the king requested her by name. So as these young virgins were going in for this tryout, for this beauty pageant to be the next queen, it was kind of a mixed bag for the family that was leaving them behind. Because they were going and they were never going to come back to the house. They were never going to come back to their family. They would probably never see them again because the king was so protective of his harem. You know, their messages might be able to be passed back and forth, but it was basically you were sending your daughter off to the king's service and you would never see her again. Maybe if she became queen, things might be slightly different, but if she lost, she would be hidden as one of his concubines for the rest of her life. It's strange in the first place that Esther goes. You know, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. Did she go voluntarily? Did she think, oh my gosh, what a neat opportunity? Or did one of the king's appointed officials there in the capital city of Susa see her and say, no, honey, you're going? We don't know which one. But we do know that when she went, Mordecai, her cousin, gave her this advice. Don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. Keep it under wraps. Don't tell anyone. Why? We don't know. We know that they were originally brought into the kingdom as a conquered people, so they were probably looked down on in that respect. Because of the different customs that they kept, they were probably viewed as problematic at times. But we don't have a real clear picture of why she was to keep this a secret. But you see, in the process of living life over the course of this year, it would have become very apparent that she was a Jew. If she had been keeping the customs of the time, she would have been celebrating specific festivals. Her diet would have been different. The ways that she prayed and interacted with God would have been different. It would have made her stand out. Because 100 years prior to this, we see that with Daniel. We see that with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They stuck out in the same kingdom because they lived differently, because they followed Jewish law. When Daniel and his friends were brought into the king's service, they were given food from the king's table, and they petitioned the person in charge of them, hey, would you just give us vegetables and water, because this stuff isn't kosher. We can't eat this. It's against our law. And he won favor with that person when he saw how great they looked and that they seemed strong and full of life. When the king made everyone bow down and worship this golden image, this golden statue, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they wouldn't bow down because it would be breaking Jewish law. It would be being unfaithful to God. And so they stuck out because of their Jewishness. And as a result, they went through their own fiery furnace. But there's no record of this with Esther. Esther seems to fit in quite well. She gains the favor of whoever sees her because of her beauty. But the reason she doesn't stick out is probably because she was more of a secular Jew than she was a religious Jew. One of the strange things about the book of Esther is the name of God is never given. Prayer is never talked about. It's very unique in that respect. And so, why would she voluntarily sign up for this beauty pageant? This beauty pageant that involved a test drive in the bedroom to get the king's approval or disapproval? Why would she want to marry a guy who is a heathen, who is a drunkard, who mistreated his first wife and asked ridiculous things of her? Why would she want to pair herself up in that way? You know, maybe she didn't have a choice, but she always had the choice to stand up and say what was right, even if it costed her her life, but she didn't. And so you have to wonder, what were her convictions? What was her relationship with God leading up to this? Was she this godly heroine that we write about? Or was her story coming into this a lot more different? Was it a lot more secular? Was it a lot more, I'm Jewish in name, but not Jewish in practice? I follow God in name, but I have no real relationship with him. Because otherwise, if she did have that relationship, she would have stood out. And we don't see that at all. So Mordecai urges her, don't tell anybody you're a Jew, and she's able to blend in for that full year during her beauty treatments. At the conclusion of the year, she goes to King Xerxes, and it says that when one of the women from the harem go in, they can take anything with them they want. Everything is at their disposal to try to sway the scales in her favor. And it says that she only takes with her what the servant who was in charge of the harem suggested. And so we see one neat thing about Esther, even though it doesn't seem like she has a relationship with God, even though it doesn't seem like she's following his laws, she knows who to take advice from. It says she follows Mordecai's advice to the T, and she goes and she seeks this guy out, and she says, what would you take if you were me? This guy knows the king. This guy knows all the women the king has been with, what he likes, what he doesn't like. He's the perfect person to go to for advice. So she puts her own ideas to the side, and she takes his advice only and takes in with her only what he suggests. She goes into King Xerxes. They sleep together, and she wins his favor, and he decides out of all these other women, he's going to make her king, or make her queen. So they hold a big festival, and she goes from being Esther to Queen Esther. She's risen from a foreigner, orphan, with no relationship really that we can see with God, to now the highest office for a woman in the country. Overnight. Her life has changed dramatically, and her cousin Mordecai, though not allowed in the king's palace, would always mingle by the gate just so he could hear some word of her. How was she doing? Was she okay? Were things all right? And one of these days, while he was hanging out by the king's gate, he overhears two of the king's guards plotting an assassination attempt for King Xerxes. Concerned, he sends word to Esther and says, hey, this is what I heard. The king's life is in danger. And Esther goes before the king without question and says, there's this guy that I know, not revealing that he's a cousin, named Mordecai, and he overheard that there's a plot for your life. You need to look into this. So they research it, they look into it, and they find out that the assassination plot is real. And they take those two potential assassins, and it says they hang them on the gallows. Now, the way that they did hanging then wasn't quite the way we do hanging now. It was more so impaling on a stick. So they do that with those two, basically to tell everyone else, if you mess with the king, this is what happens to you. Life goes back to being more normal in the kingdom. No more assassination attempts. And this man named Haman works his way up in the ranks to become second in command of the entire country for reasons we don't know. Everyone else thought he was amazing. The king thought he was great. The only person who didn't was Mordecai. Mordecai frequently at the king's gate would see Haman walk out the gate, walk in the gate, and everybody else would be bowing down, either showing him honor or worshiping him. And Mordecai would have none of that. He wasn't afraid of him, and he didn't bow down to him, and that irked Haman to no end. And he decided he needed to do something, because no matter how many people bowed down to him, it was always that one that didn't that drove him crazy. But it wasn't enough for him to just kill Mordecai. He decided he was going to exterminate all of the Jews, since Mordecai was a Jew. So he goes and they do what's called casting the lot. It was basically a superstitious deal called the pur, where they would roll out these dice to determine the best day and best month on which to pursue your course of action for it to be successful. And when they cast the lot, it came out to like the 13th month, or 13th day of the 12th month. And this was the third month of the year, so they had time. So he figures out his appropriate date, and then he goes to the king and he says, King, there's a people group scattered among your people, and they're not favorable to your kingdom. They cause problems. They choose not to obey your laws. Their customs are different than ours. I think your kingdom would be so much better off if we just got rid of them. And the king basically says, hey, that's what he thinks best. Takes off his ring and gives it to him, and it's basically like giving him a blank check with his signature on it. So Haman draws up these documents and sends them all throughout the kingdom in the native languages of the people. And it basically says that on the 13th day of the 12th month, all of the enemies of the Jews have the ability, granted by law, to kill, destroy, and steal the property of any Jews still in the area. The entire people group was to be wiped out. The messages are sent all over, and it says that King Xerxes and Haman sat down to eat. It was just a normal day for them. Basically, committing genocide wasn't ruining their appetite. It wasn't keeping them from the table. But it says all of Susa, the capital city, was up in arms. They were dismayed. How could this be happening? And Mordecai hears word. And he tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he's mourning. He's crying out and wailing, and he comes in the vicinity of the gate to the palace, but he's not allowed in because no one that is mourning is allowed into the king's presence. And so he stays out there, and Esther gets word into the palace. Mordecai, that guy you know, he's out there, and he's moaning and wailing, and he's dressed in these weird clothes and has ashes on himself. And so Esther gets really concerned. She sends clothes out to him with some of her servants, like, hey, put on some decent clothes. What's wrong? What happened? And he sends back word, Haman has basically declared our destruction. He's going to annihilate us. You've got to do something. And Esther sends back word, what do you expect me to do? She's like, we've got laws that we have to follow. And one of those laws is nobody can come into the presence of the king without being requested, without penalty of death, unless the king extends his gold scepter and you touch it. If he doesn't do that, there's two guys up there with axes that are going to basically chop you to pieces. Like, I can't go into his presence. And Mordecai writes back, or sends a message back to her. And he says, don't think that you alone are going to be safe of all of God's people. Salvation will rise up from another course. God will provide for us some other way. But if you're silent at this time, you and your whole father's household will be wiped out because of your unfaithfulness. And then what he says in chapter 4 is pretty telling. In verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will rise up from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this? How do you know that the very reason you're queen isn't anything to do with your beauty, isn't anything to do with you being royalty, but God has orchestrated things in such a way that you are the one person who has the king's ear, who cares about the plight of your people? How do you know? And I think that's the question that rings throughout this book into our lives today. You're in a very unique place. The place that you live, the neighbors that you have, the people who live next to you, the people you're in class with, the people that you work with. Unique, unlike anybody else in this room. But you go to school like you're just there to get grades. You go to school like you're just there to get a diploma. You go to work like you're just there to get a paycheck. You go to your place of business or your farm like you're just there to make a living. And I think the story of Esther is you're there for a bigger purpose than that. You're not just there to get your sheepskin. You're not just there to make a buck. You're not just there to feed kids and change diapers. You're there to change the world. But we play far too small. And that's what Mordecai had to write back to Esther. This is bigger than you, Esther. Because if you do nothing, the people around you are going to die. And isn't that the same exact thing that's going to happen to the people around us if we remain silent about the gospel? People will die an everlasting death if they aren't saved. And so Esther writes back to Mordecai. She says, tell you what, you send out a message to all the Jews you can find and ask them for 3 days to fast. 3 days of no drinking anything, 3 days of no eating anything, and my servants and I will do the same thing. And at the end of that 3 days, I will go into the king's presence, and if I perish, I perish. This wasn't some sort of resignation of God's going to do whatever God's going to do, so why should I do anything? This was I am terrified, but I will do what is necessary to try to make something good happen. But I realize that the very process of doing it, it could cost me my own life. You see, Mordecai had to remind Esther, if you do nothing, you're dead. You know, word may get out that you're a Jew. You still think it's a secret, but now because I've sent you this message, at least one of the servants know. If you do nothing, you might be safe for a little bit. But if you do nothing, everybody else is going to die. But if you are willing to risk death for the sake of everyone else you are related to, everyone else of your nationality in this entire kingdom, we could live. But if you don't do anything, they may very well die. It harkens a lot back to Matthew chapter 16. In verse 25, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for me will find it. If what we're doing with our life is just trying to play it safe, trying to get the good grades, trying to get the diploma, trying to make a few bucks so we have a little bit extra to put in the savings account, just trying to get the kids safe and not destroying the house and not destroying each other and get them till they're 18 and they go off. If that's all we're trying to do, it's not enough. We will essentially be trying to save our life, but we will be losing it because we're not using it for the kingdom. Because we were looking too small at why God has us where we are and the purpose that He has for our life. So Esther declares this 3-day fast, and the interesting thing is that this 3-day fast corresponds with the eve of the Passover, and the day after. And if you think about it throughout the course of the Jewish history, those were some pretty important days. Harkening back to the time in Egypt when the Passover was first created, they were there huddled in their homes praying that they wouldn't be killed, praying that their firstborn wouldn't be killed, praying that Pharaoh wouldn't turn on them and crush them. And then we fast forward to the Garden of Gethsemane after Jesus has had the Last Supper with His disciples, the Passover supper. And then He goes into the Garden of Gethsemane and He prays. He prays, God, if you can find salvation for the people of the world in any other way, do it. But if you can't, I offer my life for that. The same thing Esther is doing. We have no picture yet of if she's praying in conjunction with the fasting, but I have to assume that they are because those two run together so often. And at the end of 3 days, she emerges a very different woman than she was before. You see, before we have no picture of God in her life. We don't even know if she received word or if she was concerned about the Jews being exterminated, or if it took Mordecai's convincing to change something in her heart. But at the end of 3 days, she looks death in the face and she decides to do something brave. She decides to make her life count. And she goes before King Xerxes' presence and walks in knowing that any moment those 2 axes, they could be hers. And he sees her and he's pleased with her and he extends his golden scepter and she touches it. And he says, Queen Esther, what can I do for you? Up to half my kingdom, your request will be granted. And she says to him, King, my request is that you and Haman would come dine at a special banquet that I've prepared. King says, great. Grab Haman, let's go. And they go and they eat this special banquet that she's prepared. And he says, but Esther, what's your real request? Like, you didn't just come ask if we want to come have lunch. And she says, King, if you and Haman would come back tomorrow for another banquet, I will tell you my request then. And he says, very well. And they leave. And Haman walks out of the palace to the king's gate on cloud 9 because no one is invited to dine with just the king and queen. This was new. This was crazy. This meant he had arrived. And as he walks out, he sees Mordecai there. And all of his joy and all of his excitement just bleeds out because this guy won't bow down. And he goes home and he calls together his wife and his sons and his advisors and he says, what am I going to do about this Mordecai? I just had the most incredible day ever today. And this one guy saps all of my joy and excitement. And they said, why not build a gallows? Why not build it 75 feet tall and hang him on it tomorrow? And then you can go and join the king and the queen for the next banquet. And when you leave, you'll still be on cloud 9. It's like, that's a great idea. So he has it built. But that night, something unique happened. Now, why did Esther postpone it? Was she trying to build up courage? Like, why the second banquet? To me, that's inviting too many chances for things to go wrong. You've got the king there, you've got Haman there, you might as well jump on it. Did she chicken out? Was she waiting? Was the Lord telling her postpone? Why? We don't know. But she waited for that second banquet. So what happened that night is the unique part. You see, Xerxes couldn't fall asleep. And so God sovereignly orchestrates some amazing circumstances here. And I think part of the reason that the name of God is not used here is because it's showing a picture of what is God doing when you can't see him? What is God doing when nobody's talking about him? What is God doing behind the scenes? And so what God sovereignly orchestrates that night is Xerxes not being able to fall asleep. Xerxes' method of entertainment, while he can't fall asleep, he calls for the chronicles of his reign to be brought to him and for one of his servants to read to him. God sovereignly ordains the book that the servant chooses, sovereignly orchestrates the passage that the servant reads from. And he's reading and he gets to this story about the assassination attempt and how Mordecai brought it to light and how the king was saved. And the king asks, what did we ever do for that Mordecai guy? Because the king had a tendency, whenever somebody did something, he immediately returned the favor. He immediately blessed them with some sort of financial thing or some sort of party. But in God's sovereignty, he never did anything for Mordecai, even though Mordecai had saved his life. And so the servant's flipping through the pages. I don't think we did anything for Mordecai. The king's like, we've got to do something. So he says, who of my advisors is around at this hour? And so they go and they look and they say, Haman. Haman is out in the entryway waiting for you. And he says, bring him in. You know why was Haman there? He was there to ask for Mordecai's death. And before Haman can get a word out, the king's like, I'm so glad you're here. I've got this question for you. What should be done for someone that the king desires to greatly elevate? For someone that the king is greatly pleased with? Like, what could we do for them? And Haman, of course, is thinking, who else would the king like to elevate but me? What would I like? So he says, what if we take clothes that the king has worn? They're royal clothes because the king has worn them. Now whoever wears them will be clothed in royalty. And what if we put them on a horse that the king has ridden, that has the crest of the king on it, basically like symbolizing the king's crown, because then he's going to be wearing royal clothes and he's going to be riding the royal vehicle. And what if we have one of your servants, one of your high officials actually, lead him around town crying out, this is what is done for the one the king wants to honor? I think that sounds pretty good. What do you think, king? And the king says, yes. Yes, let's do that. Go get Mordecai, put him on the horse, put him in my royal robes, and you be the one to lead him around, shouting out these great things about him. Oh, Haman can barely make it through taking him throughout the town. And it says he goes home with his head covered in shame, and he goes to his wife and his children and his advisors, and he tells them what has happened. And they're like, oh, this is not good at all. Like, basically, there's no hope for you. You're essentially done for, because God has shown favor, or favor has been shown to Mordecai the Jew, and you can't stand against the Jews. This is not going to go well at all. And with that pleasant news, the knock happens on the door, and the servants of the king are there to escort him to the banquet. And so he goes to the banquet with the king and queen, thinking, maybe this will finally take this off of my mind. And he goes in, and they're eating, and they're drinking wine. And the king says to Esther, Esther, what is your request? And she says, my king, I would not have bothered you with this at all if my people had merely been sold into slavery. If we were merely being put into forced labor, I wouldn't have even brought it up. I wouldn't have bothered you. But the problem is we haven't been sold into slavery. My whole people, myself included, have been sold over to death. We have been condemned to death, me and my entire people. And the king says, who in the world would do something like that? The vile Haman. And you can just see like his drink shoot out of his mouth when he's brought up like that. And the king is furious. And he marches out to his garden to cool off and figure out what he's going to do. And Haman basically realizes his number is up. And so he does the only thing he can think of. He throws himself at Esther, begging for his life, which is kind of ironic that he has sentenced the Jews to death, and now he has to come back to a Jewish woman to beg for his own life. However, he chooses the wrong time to throw himself at Esther's feet, because when the king walks in, he thinks he's trying to molest the queen, and that's game over right there. He has them throw a bag over Haman's head, and they're about ready to execute him when one of the king's servants speaks up and says, "Hey, you know what? I just heard that Haman had built the 75-foot gallows that he was going to hang Mordecai, that guy you just honored today. He was going to hang him on it today. What if we put him on that?" The king agrees and executes Haman. Should be problem solved, right? The king brings Esther and Mordecai in, and they basically reveal the story of how they're related. Mordecai is elevated to second in command of the entire country, basically taking Haman's place. And then he takes Haman's estate and he gives it to Esther. Basically, all of his wealth, all of his servants, everything that he had now belongs to Queen Esther. She has wealth and the protection of her king. Mordecai has power and influence in the protection of the king. They're safe. But something has changed in Esther. She has been emboldened by the way God has orchestrated circumstances behind. And I think probably God has changed her heart too. Because now she cares for her people, and even though she's putting herself in that compromising situation once again, she comes to the king and she says, "It's still not enough. What about my people that are set to be executed? What about them?" And the king says, "What do you want me to do? I can't undo something that's written. It has to happen. What would you have me do instead?" And basically, she and Mordecai concoct a plan that what they will do is they will give the Jews on that same exact day the ability to kill and destroy and take all of the wealth of all the people who oppose them. But now that this edict is coming out and everybody hears that Mordecai is second in command and the Jews have the king's favor, and by the way, the queen is a Jew, the tables have totally turned. And everyone that had been making all of these plans against the Jews now realize they were the ones on the ropes. And the king allows the Jews to destroy all of their enemies. And they're finally safe. And I think both Mordecai and Esther walked away a little bit different than they were when things started. She learned how to love her people. She learned that the responsibilities that she had were greater than just her job description. I think she found faith. I think she realized that this God that is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther is behind the scenes doing all of these different things, is calling her to himself, and is showing her what it truly means to be who he has made her to be. Prior to Esther stepping up and going to speak to the king the very first time, she's referred to in the entire book of Esther as Queen Esther one time. After she does that, almost every instance that she's referred to is Queen Esther 9 times. It's like finally she stepped into the role that God had called her to. And I wonder where we are. Where does God have you? Where is the unique place that you are? And why does God have you there? I'll take this burden off your shoulders is probably not to save the Jews. You know, there's probably no mass extermination that's going to happen in the next year, God willing, that you are going to be in a place to prevent. But because of where you are, because of the people you have connection to, because of your circumstance, because of your friend groups, because of your classmates, because of your business associates, because of the people that you could go visit at parks or schools or businesses, you have a unique opportunity to speak words of life and hope into them. Will you waste it? Will you hear the words of Mordecai? Maybe you are put there for such a time as this, and will you take that to heart? Maybe you don't have much longer where you are. Take advantage of the time. Maybe it's just a fleeting interaction with somebody. Seize it while you can. But don't let the opportunity go by. Because God in his goodness may come from a different direction and may do exactly what you would have done. But the glory will not be yours and the time will be wasted. Esther came from foreign, orphan, nobody to the highest office in the kingdom. You don't need to be a king or a queen or second in command to make these type of changes, to make these type of influences. God has you somewhere for a very specific reason. Don't waste the opportunity. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, would you make us brave and would you make us bold? Would we seek you in prayer and would you show us how you want us to build these relationships, to build these friendships, to be strategic about our business partnerships and our classmates and the other moms that we know, how to leverage these opportunities. And would you forgive us for the ones that we've wasted? For the days and weeks and months and years that have gone by when we thought you just have one specific thing for us, not realizing the kingdom implication that is there. Father, would you forgive us and would you cause us to move forward and put that behind us and start a new leaf? Would you help us to see why we are where we are and to take advantage of every opportunity? And would it be for your glory? For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.